All right, everyone, welcome to our final topic of the semester. It's going to be on occupational licensing. It's found in chapter 12 in the appendix. It was written by Ed Timmons, my colleague at the Knee Center and a professor here in the economics department at WVU. So very briefly, what is occupational licensing? So occupational licensing is a set of requirements that have to be met before an individual can work in a given profession. So we typically say that it's like a permission slip from the government to be able to get a job. Basically, the state government, this is passed typically at the state level, sometimes at the local level, but the state government usually says, all right, we're creating this licensing board. If you want to work in this profession, you need to meet these specific requirements before you're able to practice in this field legally and offer your services for money. So the goal of this is obviously maybe not obviously, but the goal is consumer protection, that they set these requirements that include education, hands-on training from licensed professionals, passing exams, and a bunch of other things like, good moral character provisions, making sure they're proficient in the English language, things that they think would help with the quality of services being offered. Now, again, this is focused on services. It's not focused on goods that are being made. So, manufacturing, you're not going to have licensing like you're going to see in these service professions. Now, the reason that we license professions, and the states choose to do this as a regulatory policy, is that there is asymmetric information between consumers and between the service providers. So as a consumer, it can be very difficult to tell ahead of time what the quality of the service is going to be, whether that person is going to do a good job or a bad job. There's also typically a substantial risk of harm. So I think we license physicians. Why? Because it's difficult to tell ahead of time whether a physician is going to be good or not. And then even, if you hear, from other people who have gone to that position, whether they're good or not, it can be difficult to tell, how much of that was actually them, how much of it was the person being unhealthy or something else wrong with them that they couldn't do anything about. Really tough to tell whether they're high quality or not ahead of time. There's also a serious risk of harm. Again, if the doctor does a bad job, then there's a risk of serious injury, permanent injury, or even death. So because of that, before professionals start working, we make sure that they're high enough quality. We do this through meeting the licensing requirements. Typically in a market economy, the market does a good job of filtering out poor performers. Once they develop a reputation for offering a low quality product, consumers aren't going to go to them. They're going to go to other people, and they're fairly quickly, forced out of the market. However, when there's a serious risk of harm, or when it's difficult to tell the quality of that service provider, that's where licensing can come into play, because there's going to be a lot of pain before the market can force that low quality provider out, have them go out of business so they're no longer offering whatever good or service. A lot of people can get hurt in the meantime. So we try to limit it to people that we know are going to be high quality, know that they're going to be good enough. They're not going to harm their consumers. So some early work on licensing tried to conceptualize how it works, what it's trying to solve. So some said that licensing increases human capital. It encourages and requires professionals to build their human capital initially before they get in, and then to continue to build it while they're professionals. Typically, there's continuing education requirements where they have to go and learn more about their profession, go to conferences, things like that to try to further develop their skills. And it also improves information. So a consumer, if let's continue with the physician example, that if something's wrong with you, you need to do like more than a checkup. There's actually something, there's something going on that's wrong. You already know that. If it's still fairly minor, you may be hesitant to actually go to a physician if you don't know if any are good enough quality. If you think, well, that person, they can make me better, they can make me worse. Like, I don't know how good of a job they're going to do. You may hesitate. But if you have more information, so in this case, you have the license to say, okay, they went through medical school, they went through their residency, they passed their boards, you'll be much more willing to participate in the market. You'll feel a lot more comfortable because you know if that position is high enough quality or not. However, licensing also acts as a barrier to entry. And what we see is that licensing or professional associations tend to lobby the state legislatures to get this licensing protection, create a licensing board, and then the members of the profession can protect themselves from competition. So we have these two different things going on where we have a desire to protect consumers, to make sure that they're not being harmed by by potential low quality service providers, so they feel comfortable participating in the market. And we also have the anti-competitive nature of, like a cartel of the industry trying to prevent new people from coming in and competing against them. So now, going back to Milton Friedman and George Stigler's idea of licensing being a barrier to entry, preventing more competition, we see that it is effective in being a barrier to entry. Not the goal that we want as consumers, but it restricts the supply of workers, and it does so by up to 27%, according to some research that's been done. As we have here on the bottom of the slide, a simple model of the labor market, our neoclassical model with supply and demand. As we shift the supply of workers, moving from curve S1 to S2, was that increases the price and decreases the quantity. So this simple model, unlike what we saw for the minimum wage, because of monopsony that complicates it, for licensing we don't have these complications. We see that this simple model holds true, that licensing laws increase wages for those professionals who obtain the license, but it decreases the number of professionals there are. Estimates vary based on the profession and what data you use. In some cases, it's up to 30%. Typically, it's like 16%, around there. And again, depending on the profession and the amount of education that goes into it. Obviously, there's going to be a difference between, say, an EMT that goes through only a few weeks of training versus a physician who's going to go through 10 years before they can get their license. So we do see that the idea that Friedman and Stigler had, that licensing serves as a barrier to entry, it protects and insulates these professionals from competition. You see that this does hold true in some cases, or not in some cases. We see it typically does. Now, this has some effects on consumers, has some negative effects. It increases prices and it makes the services less convenient because there's fewer service providers out there. So the Obama White House had a landmark report on the state of occupational licensing across the country. They took all the past research, put it all together in one big report in one place. Makes it really easy to cite this stuff for people like me. But they found that research out there, as licensing tends to increase prices. Consumers pay between 3 and 16% more for these services that are from licensed professionals compared to a similar unlicensed professional. Now, pricing data can be hard to get and hard to work with, so we don't have this for a ton of different professions out there. It's just limited to a few of them. And there's little evidence that licensing actually improves quality. So there's little evidence that it actually achieves its goal. So only 2 of the 12 studies that were included found evidence that licensing improved quality. And there's been some more cool recent research that's been being done looking at like Yelp reviews and looking at places like Angie's List, where you can go to service providers. Some are licensed, some are not, depending on your locality or the state you're in. And what they've found is that consumers don't really care about whether an individual is licensed or not. They care about what the other consumers rate them. Barbers and cosmetologists, they require a license. We typically think of things like healthcare. We think of lawyers, highly trained professionals where there's a serious risk of negative things happening. But there's a lot of professions that don't require a traditional 4-year college degree, that don't pose this risk, that require a license. Barbers and cosmetologists are 2 of them. I never knew that barbers and cosmetologists were licensed. I relied on, well, not the internet back then, just on word of mouth from friends and family to know who was good, who to go to. And that's what consumers tend to care about versus caring about that licensing status, whether they're licensed or not. Now, why am I talking about this? Why should we care about licensing? Well, the occupational licensing has grown substantially. On this graph we see here the percent of the workforce that are licensed and unionized. The red line is unionized. We should recall that from the 1950s through the 2000s, the percent of workforce that's licensed has gone steadily downward. Manufacturing is not a big component of the U.S. economy anymore. We've shifted towards more of the service sector. So we've seen licensing increase. So about 5% of the 1950s of the labor force had to obtain a license in order to work. Today, that number is up around 25%. From Kleiner Kruger in 2010, this was much higher, just based off of the particular poll that they used to ask it. But now, starting in like 2016, the federal government started collecting this. I think it was the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So we have more accurate and annual data. And now they find that it's like 24-25% of the workforce that requires an occupational license. So today, more people and about double the people are require a license than are in labor unions. And only about 2% of workers in 2017 earned the minimum wage. So minimum wage, which gets a lot of talk in the press and something that politicians are constantly fighting about, affects a much smaller portion of the workforce than professional licensing. Now, it may seem like I'm kind of wasting your time here talking about licensing because licensing is for service providers. They tend to work on their own or for like a small group, together with a small group of service providers. And you guys are in human resources, so going into something, different, going into a different type of working environment. And that may be true, but in healthcare, licensing is ubiquitous. Basically, if you want to be reimbursed through like Medicare and Medicaid, the healthcare professionals have to be licensed. So it's virtually mandated at the federal level. So if you work in healthcare, this is something to be cognizant of, something to understand. And it's important to know the difference between licensing and between certification. Your textbook talks about it a little bit. Basically that with a professional license, remember, you're required to obtain that license before you can practice. You're legally not allowed to. The state of Florida does they'll do undercover stings, and they'll send in the police and arrest service providers that are not licensed. I had not been after the most recent hurricane that hit Florida. Well, not the most recent, the real bad one towards the end of summer. There was an out-of-state contractor who came in, volunteered his time with the police department, and then was offering, his services as roofer, trying to help them rebuild. The cops went in and arrested him, straight up, slapped handcuffs on him the next day because he wasn't licensed in the state of Florida. He was licensed in Texas, where he came from. Yeah, sorry, a bit of a tangent there. But what I was trying to say is that, that licensing, there's that legal requirement. It's different than things like a certification, even though sometimes the law will use them interchangeably. So for instance, there's certified public accountants. You can be an accountant. You can do a lot of the work that a CPA does if you don't have that CPA. You're just not allowed to call yourself a certified public accountant. So for things like certification, you're allowed to work in the profession without the license. Another example is the PE, the professional engineering. They call it a license, but it's really not a license. It's more of a certification. I have a friend who's a civil engineer, and when I started working on this stuff, he was asking me about it because he was working towards his PE. And I said, basically, compared to the stuff that I researched, actual occupational licenses, what you have is a little bit different, that you're able to practice ahead of time. It's not the same barrier to entry that we see with occupational licensing. There are other weaker forms of regulation, but their licensing is the most stringent. Then you have like certification. Below that, things like registration, where basically you go to the state and you give them your information. You say, I am a service provider in this industry. I'm a barber, if barbers have that. And then you give them your name, your home address, the location of your business, and then you call it a day. So if you do something wrong, a consumer can sue you afterwards, but they're not preventing you from coming in and starting to work. So again, it's much less of a barrier to entry. And there's a lot of other alternatives we could talk about that I'm not going to waste your time with because, we're not discussing policy here. We're trying to just see what the effects of different labor market regulations are. So finally, we'll end here on the slide. I'm already running long, much longer than I wanted to for what's going to be the final topic. So just to think conceptually, when can licensing work and when do we think it's not going to be effective? So licensing can be an effective regulation. I said we really don't see an effect on quality. There has been some work done that has shown for like early physicians and certified nurse midwives like 100 years ago, it helped professionalize the profession, so to speak, that it required them to undergo education where this wasn't a thing in the past. And it did improve quality and especially sanitation back then. But more recent stuff, again, it's difficult to measure the quality of services, but more recent work has found that there hasn't been much of an effect. But licensing can work, and conceptually, it's designed for when there's an information asymmetry, when consumers don't know ahead of time just how good that professional is, whether they're good or whether they're bad. It's even more effective, or most effective, when it's difficult to tell the quality even after the service has been provided. So if you don't know ahead of time whether they're going to be good or not, and then you can't ask other people who have gone to that service provider because they can't really tell you, they might have an opinion, but they could be totally wrong, then that's when we think that licensing will have the most value. You can say, okay, well, at least they've done all this education, they've been trained, they passed these exams, we know they meet this minimum level of quality, we know they've hit that, so they can't be completely terrible. And it's also important that there's a high risk of harm to the consumer. So it's not just, someone does a bad job mowing your lawn. It's that there's a chance of serious long-term negative consequences. It could be health consequences. It could be maybe financial consequences. Like for lawyers, if your lawyer does a bad job because they're not properly trained, they don't know what they're doing, you could spend the rest of your life in jail. That's very bad, especially if you're innocent. But licensing isn't well designed, and it won't work when hiring decisions are made by an expert. So for instance, in I think 23 or 25 states, if you want to be a veterinarian technician, so work under a vet, you have to be licensed. Now, it makes sense for the vet to require a license based on the idea of information asymmetry and the high risk of harm to the consumer, I guess in this case to the consumer's pet. Difficult to tell ahead of time how good a vet is going to be and whether the pet dying or recovering from their illness is due to what the vet did versus whether it was just what was going on with the pet themselves. But for veterinary technicians, the vet is the expert, so they can tell ahead of time whether this vet tech is going to be high quality or not, whether they meet the needs that the practice has. So it makes a lot less sense to have licensing then. Then you get the negative consequences, the higher wages, higher prices, fewer people entering the profession because of these barriers to entry. Also, when there's a low risk of harm, like if someone messes up mowing your lawn, not that big of a deal. You pay a different neighborhood kid $10 later, like the next week to fix it. Likewise, when the purchase of a service is frequent, something you commonly do, it's much easier to build up a knowledge of the good and bad service providers. If you're going, twice in your life to purchase a service from a service provider, then it's much more difficult to find out. And if you're wrong, then you're stuck with that decision for 30 years versus being stuck with it for a week. And finally, this is getting a little bit into like nitty-gritty public policy. But when there's more direct forms of regulation possible, occupational licensing, you get all the negative, you still get the negative cost, but you either get the same benefits at a much higher cost, or you get a lower benefits. It's less effective at a higher cost. So for instance, for licensing cosmetologists and barbers, a lot of the concern is that the shops are going to be dirty, that there's going to be, there's going to be issues with that. So instead of requiring licensing, if we're more concerned about what's going on in the shop, we can do facility inspections. Like they inspect restaurants, we do the same thing for barbers and cosmetologists. Focus on what we think that issue is going to be, rather than putting up these broad barriers to entry for everyone. Let me just check this. Yeah, I think that covers basically everything in the appendix. I guess since this is the last, lecture we're doing, I wanted to thank you for being a part of this class. This is the inaugural class in the Master of HR Leadership program. I'm excited to be a part of that and to watch this grow over the next, through the years. And I thank you for your patience with this class as we've been working through. There's always kinks in the first class. I'm struggling with eCampus. I feel like my dad trying to work the technology and being constantly looking at, well, what the hell is this problem? What's causing that? But honestly, I am appreciated this, and I hope you had a great semester. I hope this gave you some information that you could take and be practical for your in your human resources career. At the very least, if not, I hope this serves as a very good signaling mechanism for your employers that they're going to be good employees and know what you're doing.